It's amazing the sort of things that you hear when you're walking down the street. And I remember Kenneth Williams was very good on this subject. Kenneth Williams and Alan Bennett, they're both extraordinary about picking up other people's conversations. Kenneth Williams got a line where I think somebody's coming off the bus and they mishear Shaftesbury Avenue as "Let's be having you," and he says, "Woo, not without Miss Strawberries." Um, what it means, goodness knows. But getting little bits of information, how we put them back together, and how we reassemble the dissecta membra. In the end, I think some words are floating around, and rather like a dream, we find sense, but it may not be the sense that's intended. And when it comes to reform and the Conservative Party, I'm afraid that the sense is quite um, uh, evaded. The sense has gone. The Conservative Party is in an existential crisis and is heading for disaster. The Reform Party is in the position that the SDP was in 1983. It looks magnificent, but it could well end up yielding no seats at all. And its members, according to George Osborne, are quite openly debating an electoral pact. And this isn't a fringe discussion, he says, but the dominant conversation among Tory MPs. The Conservative Party is facing electoral wipeout. But I think before we get to that point, there will be an exodus of MPs into reform, leaving the floor of the Commons chamber open to the Lib Dems to take over as His Majesty's loyal opposition. And the party is expected to perform disastrously. That's the Conservative Party, and we'll see that in May. And I think May or June, you'll suddenly see this mass exodus, like something out of a Cecil B. DeMille film. It won't be the waters opening. It will probably be the anxiety will lead to serious medical crises. And the last time all these seats were contested, Boris Johnson's government was at its peak, riding the Brexit wave and still basking in the glow of a large parliamentary majority. And this time, the political landscape is very different. The Tories are trailing in the polls. Reform UK is gaining momentum. I hesitate to use the word momentum given the way Jeremy Corbyn manipulated that word. An increasing number of MPs like Esther McVeigh. Esther McVeigh. Who would have taken Esther McVeigh seriously? It's laughable. She's calling for a formal alliance. Anything to keep her name in the headlines. On paper, a deal makes sense for the right. The fragmentation of the Conservative vote risks handing Labour a supermajority. Reform UK, led by Farage and Tice, is still largely defined by Brexit, but has been siphoning off disillusioned Tory voters, particularly on immigration, net zero policies. In theory, an electoral agreement could consolidate the right-wing vote and prevent an electoral slaughter. But this is where the problem begins. As Osborne highlights, reform's price for an alliance is no minor compromise. It's the premiership of Nigel Farage himself. And while some Tory MPs might privately be willing to concede this point, I'm not shallow. The optics of an established governing party effectively capitulating to a challengers in a party that's only got 5 seats is that is the axe of finality, isn't it? Osborne's argument is that this debate will consume the Conservative Party. It's a starting trigger of collapse, isn't it? The more reform surges in the polls, the more backbench MPs fearful for their seats will publicly advocate a deal, and this will overshadow any attempt by figures like Kemi Badenoch to outline a coherent Conservative vision. And the fact that she doesn't, the fact that she tries to outdo Farage, disaster, it's going to be a disaster. What was the line she said? I'm going to be hard. Well, Kemi Badenoch is as limp as yesterday's dishcloth, frankly, and and the party's internal identity is not helped by her desperation and her inability to actually do the job. And the defining feature of her leadership will be the collapse of the Conservative Party. A pact elevates reform from insurgent pressure group to a serious electoral force, an electoral farce, and I think there's every possibility there might be a pact even before we get into May, because the Conservatives will be fearing that the rout will be so enormous, and it will lead to civil war in the Conservative Party. Not all Tories would accept a deal that puts Farage at the top. Figures like Rishi Sunak, Tom Tugendhat would resist an alliance with a party that they would see as too radical. And the risk of a split within the Conservatives would be high. And I don't know whether they would be able to keep the Conservative name or whether they would find themselves setting up their own party, which might be closer to the Lib Dems. The Labour would weaponise any deal as proof that the Conservatives are lurching towards extremism, which they are, because Kemi Badenoch doesn't have the ability to define anything else. She can hardly define a shoestring. And Keir Starmer would frame the May local elections, as a choice between centre-left stability and a right-wing coalition of mad people, resembling a Trumpian movement, a Trumpian movement. Up in the north, a Trumpian movement is simply a euphemism for flatulence, trumping. And then there's Nigel Farage. While he's not currently that successful, he knows how to. He's the leader of 5 people, but he knows how to control the House. He knows how to use his influence in a way that almost no one else in the House of Commons at the moment can do. If reform's price for a deal is his premiership, the Tory leader, whoever it may be, it's a disaster, would have to decide whether they're willing to play second fiddle to a man who has only just, for the first time after 8 attempts, been elected to Parliament. Farage, for his part, would relish the opportunity to shape this right-wing agenda, pushing hardline stances on immigration, net zero, Brexit purity. The conversation about a Tory reform pact is, at its core, a symptom of Conservative decline. It's the desperate gamble of a party that has lost confidence in its ability to win outright. But it's also a gamble with potentially irreversible consequences. And should it happen, the British right could resemble the Republican Party in the United States, pulled increasingly toward populism, nationalism, ideological purity at the expense of broad electoral appeal. And the alternative, a Conservative Party that tries to redefine itself in its own terms under a leader that can barely articulate a sentence and an argument. It risks being overwhelmed in itself by reform's insurgency. And as George Osborne warns, this debate is only just beginning. And as the Tories prepare for an electoral reckoning, the question must be, is a pact with reform a path to survival or a shortcut to irrelevance? I know exactly what I think.